In this video, we'll learn how to program in JavaScript. We're going to get it set up and running on your local computer so you can follow along. Whether you're brand new or just need a quick refresher, this roughly 30-minute course is designed to expose you to the fundamentals of JavaScript. During the video, I recommend that you either speed me up by using the settings playback feature or slow me down if I go a bit too fast. It's recommended to use an AI like ChatGPT on subjects you have more questions on, or just feel free to reach out with a comment. All of the links, including the source code used for this course, are in the description, so let's get started. Let's get started by downloading Visual Studio Code. You'll want to download the version that's specific to your operating system by clicking the download button. This should provide you an executable that you can run on your local computer and just choose all of the default options. Links for all of these downloads will be available in the video description and on our website. Once you have Visual Studio installed, you should see a screen something like the one on the left-hand side. Now, we're going to install a couple extensions to enhance our development environment. Extensions allow you to give additional features to Visual Studio that aren't built in by default. And the ones that we're going to install are helping us with HTML and JavaScript. Now you should see a set of blocks over here called extensions. You'll want to click on it, and when you click on it, you should be prompted with a search dialog. The first one that we're going to install is called HTML CSS support. Once you've searched for it, you should be able to find it here. Now I already have mine installed, but you should see an install button around here. You want to click on it and it should install the extension. Once it's installed, the next one that we want to install is something called ESLint. This is another extension that helps us with some of our JavaScript support. You want to go ahead and click on this one as well and install it. Once you have both of those installed, we should be ready to go. Okay, now that Studio is set up how we want, let's go ahead and click on this Explore button so that we can get our project started. Then we'll want to click on the Open Folder icon. Now you can place this anywhere you want on your system. I've chosen to place mine into a directory called Tutorials, and I'm going to create a new folder here called JSLearn. You can follow along with me, or you can name it whatever you want. Once you've done that, you want to select the folder that you've chosen to use for the project, and then click Select Folder. This will then allow Studio to create an environment where we can place all of our files. Okay, so the first file we're going to create here is called index.html. Now you don't need to know HTML for this particular tutorial, but we're going to go ahead and use it to house where we're going to store our JavaScript. And we're also going to want to come up here and create another one called test.js. This is where we're going to store all of our test files as we go through this learning process. Now you want to jump back over here to the index.html file, and the extensions that we installed earlier allow us to create some pretty quick templates. So if you click HTML and then go down to 5, this will actually create a template for us so that we can start the development process for getting our JavaScript started. Okay, so before we get started actually coding, we want to go ahead and turn on auto save in Visual Studio. This will help save us time from having to hit Control S or save the file every time. Basically what it does is it will save the file as you do a keystroke or a key up. So if you click on File and come down here to auto save, you'll want to make sure that that's on. And this way you won't have to save your file anymore. So what we want to do right now is we want to test and make sure that this index.html file is working. So go ahead and type the word hello in the body of the HTML index.html file. And you don't have to hit save anymore because autosave's on. And what you want to do is open a browser. I'm using Firefox. You can use whatever you want. In Firefox, you'll go ahead and hit Control O. And what this will do is it'll open a dialog. And you can open up the file that you just created, which was index.html. So go to the location where you save that, open the index file, and you should see, as this opens up, the word hello. Now you can see we're ready to actually start our development process. Okay, so the easiest way to get started with some JavaScript is just creating what they call script tags. And you can go ahead and put the script tag right in the body of your HTML. And then you can also write the word console.log. And what this will do is it'll allow you to log information to the JavaScript console. And the way that you see the JavaScript console is if you come back over to your browser over here and you right click, and then you come down to this inspect option, it will open up a utility that allows you to see what's going on in your HTML page. Now, it'll always default to inspector, but you'll need to jump over here to console. Now, as you see here, the word test has been logged to our console. Now, if for whatever reason your inspector opens up in a whole new window, you can change that by checking where you want to dock it. Brave and Chrome are going to have very similar features, so you just kind of want to look for something about docking. And I would recommend docking it to the bottom for the rest of this tutorial just to kind of follow along. It'll make things a lot smoother. Okay, so the next way that we can actually interface with JavaScript is through a JavaScript reference. And we can do that up here in the same sense that we did down there. We're going to go ahead and write the script tag up here. But instead of calling it inline, we're going to reference it from a source file, and that source file was test.js. So what we can do here is we can open up this test.js file, and we can say the same thing that we said earlier, and we can say log. And now we're going to type test2, right? And we're going to save this. And whenever I refresh this page, I should see 2 console logs. So I refresh this, and I see test2 and test. Notice that test2 actually executed and was ran before the second test. That's because this script tag is up at the top. Now, if I move this script tag towards the bottom, which is also legal in JavaScript, you can move it down here, and I refresh the page, you'll notice that the tests are actually operated in the separate order. So everything is basically called in the order in which it's executed. So you can move stuff around however you want. And just note that when you start to develop more sophisticated applications, there's going to be techniques that you want to use. But as far as this video, just understand that we're going to be working with the inline script tag and a script tag. So whichever way you prefer, you can use either one. Okay, so before we get into learning actual syntax, we'll want to talk about how you can write comments. Comments are basically notes about what you're getting ready to do or what the program does. And to do comments, you simply denote them with a // and then you can write whatever you want in here. Typically, your comment is going to be anything about what you're getting ready to program or getting ready to do. You can also do larger sets of comments by a /*, and then you're going to say * / again. And then you can write as much as you want in here. So you can write a big set of comments. So just know that comments are used to track notes, and that's how you denote them, is with those particular types of symbols. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get started with doing some actual programming. Let's go ahead and comment out this line here. And then we're going to go ahead and jump over to our JS file. So open up the test.js file, and we're going to start learning variables. Variables are basically a way to store different values. And all programming languages have them, and it's just an easy way for you to manipulate and control data. So a quick example of a variable would be something like var a equals foo. And all I did was I assigned the value of a to a string called foo. Now you might be asking, what is this var? The var is a way to just declare that it's a variable. There are a couple other ways that you can declare variables. You can even use the word let, or you can use the word const, but we're not going to deal with those right now. For now, we're just going to use the term var, and we'll talk about those other types later on. So what we want to do with the variable is control data. So in real life, when you're programming, you're not going to give the variable a to foo. I mean, you might see some programmers do it, but typically it's kind of frowned upon. Typically, you're going to give it a descriptive name, and you're going to say something like book title, and you're going to say equals, say, programming JS. We'll say programming JS. And so you can see now that book title is assigned this string programming JS. Now, if we wanted to get the value of that book title, we can go ahead and put book title in here, and we'll come back over to our console again. Let's refresh this, and we'll see that programming JS right here is being echoed out in this variable. So variables are just a way to store data, and there's several different ways that you can store variables. You can just store variables as a number. You can set a variable as a string. You can set it to a value of null, which means it's just nothing. You can also assign it to floating type values, which are decimal values. And then you can also assign them to functions and to arrays and to objects, but we're not going to cover that right now. We're just going to deal with what they call the primitive data types. And the primitive data types are typically just your numbers, your strings, and your simple values. So that should cover getting started with just a high-level set of variables. Okay, so the next thing that we want to cover here are what they call operators. And operators simply allow us to enhance the availability of what we do with our variables. You can do arithmetic operators, you can put strings together, and you can do all kinds of stuff. So the best way to get started is with an example. And I'm going to go ahead and paste one in here real quick. And what I have here is a new variable called book cost, and I'm going to add two numbers together. Say the cost of the book was $10 and the shipping was $2. And if we refresh our console here, we'll see that the output should be 10 plus 2 is 12. And the operator that we used here was a plus operator. So this is an arithmetic operator. Now, you'll remember that earlier we had assigned these variables. Well, these are what they call assignment operators. So you're going to be working with a bunch of different operators throughout your JavaScript programming career or whatever you're doing with JavaScript. And just know that there's quite a few of them. Another quick example of an operator would be, say we wanted to add a $sign to the front of this variable. We could easily do that in JavaScript by just adding a string to the book cost. Now, in some other programming languages, you can't do this, but in JavaScript, this is allowed. And so if we refresh our screen down here, you'll see that, well, we just added $12 to the cost. So that's an example of using operators in JavaScript. The next area that we're going to cover are what we call functions. And functions are just a way for you to group your code into smaller little programs. Now, I have an example here. And the example that we're working with is just going to be adding to what we did before. Now, the way that you call a function is with this keyword function. And then you give the function a name. In our case, we're going to get the book title. And the function also has the ability to accept parameters. Now, you don't have to pass parameters, but you can. And if you wanted to pass more parameters, then you would add just additional parameters in here. And we'll show you how parameters work in a second. Now, within the context of these curly brackets is the execution part of the program. So think of this whole thing as a simple program, and we're going to execute this code. So if I go ahead and refresh this page here, we have this console.log, and I refresh this page, you're going to see that nothing happens, right? We're still up here on this one, the book cost, because this function was never executed. So in order for us to execute this function, what we want to do is simply call it. And we just call it simply like this. And if we refresh our page here, we'll see that it says programming.js undefined. So our program was called. However, this variable author was never passed to the program, so it doesn't know what to do with it. So it just echoes out undefined. So if we wanted to add additional functionality to this function, we could just pass, say, Corey here, and we refresh it. And as you'll see, it added that variable. So what happens is whatever you change this to, it will change the variable that's passed. And so anytime you want to pass data to this particular little functioning code unit, you can easily do that. And notice that we're using an additional operator here, the plus minus operator. So there's a lot of operators that start working, and you'll start to put all these pieces together. But this is just a simple high-level overview of how you work with functions. Moving on to our next topic, we're going to be talking about arrays. Arrays are simply a way to store more data in a variable. So I'm going to go ahead and paste an example of an array here. And as you can see, I declare an array similar to the way that I did a variable. You start with a var in front, and I gave this one called book title array. An array will start with an opening bracket and a closing bracket, and it's consisted of data separated by a comma. Now, if we want to go ahead and look at the value of this array, we can echo it out here in the console, and I'm going to go ahead and refresh this here. And you'll see that if we open up this little chevron guy here, the value of the array is shown right here, right? So all these values are right here. And you can see that internally, JavaScript manages what they call a key on the array. And you'll notice that in front of the array is a value starting at 0. It's called the key. And on the right-hand side is the actual value. So you have a key and a value. And in this particular example, we have a total of 5 values. So if I wanted to add more information to this array, I could easily do that by just adding a new string here, adding a comma at the end. I'm going to refresh this again. And as you see, foo is added. Well, what happened is that the index of this array was changed. Before this, JavaScript, the good parts, had an index of 0, and now it has an index of 1. So as you add more values on or subtract them, the length of the array will change and the index of the array will change. Now, these values are very powerful because you can access just particular elements. So say I wanted to only access that first array, and I can do that by adding brackets around the array and accessing only that particular index value. So let's go ahead and refresh this here. And you'll notice that I'll be saying index and key. In the terminology of arrays, you can use that interchangeably. It's either called the index or the key. And as you can see here, JavaScript, the good parts, was echoed out. The only value that I wanted to call was that particular one. So you can see that the array is a way to store more data versus your variable, which could only store, a number, a string, a null, or a boolean. The arrays can store a lot more data. So you'll be working with arrays a lot in JavaScript, and this is just a quick primer on getting started with them. The next complex data structure that I want to show here is what we call objects. And objects are very similar to an array. However, they reflect more of a real world scenario. So the example I have here is a book. And objects are very similar to the array that you construct them similarly. However, remember in the array we had an opening bracket, where in here we have a curly bracket. And the array had a value that was stored internally, the index and the key. In the value of the object, you'll see down here that the title or the key must be declared out, and it's separated by a colon. So let's go ahead and take a quick look and peek at what an object looks in the console. So we'll open this up, and you'll see that it says object here, where before it would say array, and all of our values are displayed here. Now, the one thing to note about an object is that if we redeclare one of these index values, so say I write title again here, and I just say foo, and I reload this, it is going to override the value that we had at the beginning, right? So you can only have one unique value. And in order to access these values individually, you can use the dot notation. So if you say book dot title, and we just want to echo that out, we can do that, and you'll see that it says foo. Now, if we remove foo from this list here, and we go back to what we had before, it should return back to the JavaScript by gridlife.io. So that's a quick way on how to access and look at objects. So now we're going to talk about complex objects. And if you're following along, you'll notice that I went ahead and commented out a lot of this code just so we can have a cleaner console. And let's go ahead and look at a complex object. So as you see here, I have two new variables declared. One is called book1 and book2. And in my third variable, I'm declaring an array, and I'm actually putting both of those objects in the array. So if we take a quick peek at what that looks like in the console, we can see that the initial value here is an array, but inside we have two objects. Well, an array can really hold anything you want. So if you wanted to go ahead and just append a string to the end of the array, you could do that as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. And you can see that this array now has this final value of test. We'll go ahead and peek in here real quick, 1, 2, and 3. So arrays are pretty dynamic in that you can put anything you want in them. And if you want to access specific values within that array, you can easily do that too. So say we wanted to get the title from book 2, we could do that. But remember, our index is at index 1 in the library array. And then we want to go ahead and access the title, right? So when we refresh this here, we can see that we're going to get C# by gridlife.io. So what we're doing is we're going into the library, we're going to the first value, then we're accessing the title. So complex objects are very important in programming, and as you continue to use these objects and put them together, you can find great ways to really enhance your programming skills in JavaScript. The next section we're going to move into here are conditional statements. And at the heart of every programming language are conditional statements. Now, we're only going to cover the if and the switch statement. So let's go ahead and get started with a sample here. And you'll see here that the first if condition that I have is just a basic if-else condition. So what we have here is a variable, which we created earlier. And you'll see that we have this first if block. So what happens here is the if block will evaluate this value inside of the parens. And if the value inside of the parens is true, then this condition here is executed, else the other condition is executed. So we can see that the price on the book is greater than 10. So when we reload this, we should see that it says, I recommend buying this book. That's the heart of an if-else statement. So let's go ahead and do one that's a little bit more complex. If you click the Control K U, you can actually uncomment all the code. So that's just a little quick tip in Visual Studio Code. And if you wanted to comment it all, you can click Control K, Control C, Control K, Control U. That just toggles that on and off. And that's really useful whenever you're working with Visual Studio Code. So this next one actually uses an additional else if statement. So what happens in this control flow is it will look for a rating here. It'll say if the book rating is greater than 4.5, then it will echo this guy, otherwise this one, else this one. And this next one, you'll notice that there's an actual if on here, so there's a conditional logic that has to be met. So if we reload this one, we'll see that this value right here was the one that was executed. We see that the book rating is less than or equal to 3.5, which is right here. So this example shows you how to work with some basic if structures. Let's go ahead and do one more example with the if, and in this case, we're going to add an additional operator. Now you'll see that we've added this additional conditional check within the if statement. Remember earlier when we were talking about operators? Well, the and sign together is an operator that makes sure that it looks for this value to be true and this value to be true. So if both of these values are true, then this if block will be executed. Now, if this value doesn't equal to true, then it obviously comes down to this else block. So let's go ahead and run this real quick and see what we get. So we execute this and it says, recommend buying this book. That means both of these conditions were true. Well, what happens if we remove this equals operator and we run this? Now we can see that it doesn't evaluate the true. And this is because 4 is not greater than 4. 4 is actually equal to 4. So if you put the equal sign back here, you'll see that those values have to be equal in order for this condition to be met. Now you can also do what they call an OR expression. So we'll put two pipes together and let's see what happens when we run this. It says recommend buying them. Well, why did that happen? Well, an OR condition only looks for one true value in the string of operations. So if any one of these are true, then it will come down here. So you can see that you can use multiple operators in here to control your if block. And sometimes these can get really complex. And so you'll have to use, discernment on how you want to do this, and there's strategies on how to do that. But this should give you kind of a high level overview on how to add operators within your if blocks. Let's go ahead and look at a switch statement example. So you'll see here that a switch is similar to an if condition in that it does deterministic logic. But the way that it works is you create this switch keyword, and then inside of the parens, you determine what you want your value to be. So in this particular case, we're going to look for any of these case statements that evaluate to true, right? So what will happen is when the compiler comes down, it'll say which of these case statements is true because it's trying to look for a true value. And it will return the one that returns true first. So if this particular case statement was true, then it will return this and then it'll hit this break statement and it'll exit completely out of the switch. So even if this case statement and this case statement were true, it will only execute this first one right here. Now there's also something called a default keyword. And what the default allows us to do is if none of these case statements return true, then it will run this particular line of code. So you can use a default if you want. If you don't, you can remove the default. And if none of these were true, then what would happen is nothing. Basically nothing at all would run through the case statement. But if you want something to come out, you can always use a default. And just like we used operators in an if statement, you can use the same thing here. So this is basically a high-level overview of how a switch statement works. So the next structure we're going to be looking through here are what we call loops. And loops allow you to iterate over the data structures that we showed earlier. Remember when we were talking about arrays and objects? Well, loops are a great way to iterate over these objects. And when you're working in programming, you're going to be putting if conditions, removing data from the loops, so forth and so on. But in these examples, we'll just give you a quick high-level overview of what the loops are and kind of how they work. So right now I have an object called books, which is an array of objects again. So we see all of these objects. And I have three different loops here, a for loop, a forEach loop, and a while loop. Now, if I run this code, you'll see over here in the console that each one of these loops did the exact same thing. So you might be saying, well, if there's multiple loops, why do I need multiple types? Well, each of them works slightly different, and as you get more involved in your programming, you'll find usages for each one. So let's go ahead and talk about the first one. This is the basic for loop. And what this does is this operates over three different distinct principles here. The first section that we see here is we declare a variable within this for loop, and we're using the let keyword, and we need to use that because the let keyword allows you to have the context of this variable index only be executed within this bracket. So we're going to be using the let keyword here. And then what the second part of this for loop does is it does a condition, and it says once this index value, which originally starts at 0, once it is less than the length of the book, remember we have 4 books in here, in this array, and this array is going to be a length of 4. Once its length is greater than that, then you need to break out of the loop. And so in order for us to keep iterating over the loop, we have a third condition in here separated by the semicolon, and this value is incrementing. So what this plus plus operator does is it allows this index to keep going 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's going through the loop each time. So a for loop allows you to iterate over arrays very easily and access those values. So remember earlier where we were accessing the array from value 0 or value 1 or value 2 and so forth and so on? Well, as you're iterating over each one of these, this value index is actually incrementing. And so that's where we're getting the value for each one of these. And so that's basically how a simple for. The next one that we want to look at is a forEach. Now a forEach loop does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And so what's happening internally is there's an iterator that knows how to look at this object and know that it's going to have to go over it 4 times. And inside of this forEach loop, it does its magic, and what you can do is reference this object, book.title, like we did earlier, and it'll just take care of a lot of it for you. Now, the last loop that we have here is a while loop, and it will continue to operate until this condition is no longer true. So while this condition is true, it'll just keep looping through, and you can see here that we're actually incrementing the index of that array, and once this hits false, then it exits out of this. Now, inside of each one of these loops, you can add additional logic to say continue or break, or do various different things inside the loop. We're not going to go over that in this video series because this is more of a beginner's, but do know that each one of these loops have conditional logic that can control that. So this should give you a high overview of the looping structures available within JavaScript. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this video with something called variable scoping. And what this section is going to cover is how we can use variables within the context of an entire JavaScript application or JavaScript program. We're also going to introduce 2 new variable types, const and let. The first one that I have here is called const, as you can see on line 173. And a constant stands for constant. basically const stands for constant. And what that allows us to do is to create a fixed variable. So if I try to run this particular set of code, we're going to see that I actually get an error on line 174. That's because I try to redeclare this variable. So if we use just a regular var type and we reran this, this is completely legal, right? So this will come through and it says I can't be changed even though it's a var type. But when you set it to a const type, it cannot be redeclared and you will get an error. So you'll need to understand that when you're using this constant type. So let's go ahead and comment this out, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section here. The next section is understanding the scope of variables within a function scope. So let's say we declared this first variable called global var. We also declared it within the context of a function global var, and then we declare it down here. So if we rerun this particular code, we should see that I get I'm global, I'm local, and I'm global, right? So it worked 3 times. The error that we got here now is what we call a local variable. So within this function, I declared a variable called local var. Well, when you declare a variable within a function inside of the curly brackets, you can't reuse this variable outside the context of this function. Otherwise, you'll get a reference error. So this is a concept that you need to understand when you're working with variables at a global scope. So the next section we want to talk about here is called block scope. And the easiest way to really get your head wrapped around this one is just remember that block scope deals with the beginning curly brace and the end curly brace. And so we're going to use this new let keyword, and that's what really allows block scope to work. So say you declare a new variable with the let keyword and you say I'm function scoped and I'm block scoped, and we go ahead and run this, we should see that the only one that did not work would be on this particular line 202, because let var is only available within the scope of this curly bracket. But you see let var 1 is available within the scope of this curly bracket. That's why it works here. And it would also work down here if I called it outside. So block scope is pretty simple. Just remember that wherever you declare the variable, look for the curly brackets. So this last example is a pretty advanced example, and most likely you're not going to run into it, but just so that you know that there are some interesting scenarios that you can use with JavaScript. And basically what this one says is that if you have a variable that's assigned to a function, and then you call that function and it has an internal function that has a variable that was declared in the outer function, that you can still get access to that outer variable by using what they call a lexical scope. And so I know that that's a lot, that's a mouthful, but if you look at the example and study it, you can see that you can have access in all kinds of different layers. So I hope that covers all of the scoping that you would actually need in most JavaScript programs. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial on JavaScript. If you have any other questions, leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, please consider leaving a thumbs up. And if you have a chance, check us out on gridlife.io, and we'll see you in the next video.